Saat Farkı'ndan merhaba. Her hafta dünyadan farklı seslere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta ABD'den, Washington DC'den bir konuğum var. Afganistan'ı konuşacağız. Irak'ta ve Afganistan'da görev yapmış, gazi rütbesiyle emekliye ayrılmış eski bir Amerikan askeri, aynı zamanda analist. Son dönemde özellikle Afganistan üzerine çok sayıda yazı kaleme aldı. Benim de dikkatimi çekti. Bugün eski bir Amerikan askerinin perspektifinden Afganistan'ı konuşmak istedik. Herman de la Roche bizlerle Washington DC'den. Welcome, Herman.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for participating. Taliban took the full control of Afghanistan. And first of all, let me ask, are you surprised? Because Biden and his team apparently is surprised, or you saw that coming already?
I am not surprised. It's something I've written about in Spy Chest, my newsletter throughout this year, beginning early spring. But I would actually just take a step back and say the Biden administration is probably not surprised. That what is a surprise is the speed of it, right? And that's very difficult to know. Conditions on the ground, even for the military to track, it's not the easiest thing in the world. And so the collapse that was months into days into hours, that is not something that anyone can really predict. What I think could be predicted was that Kabul would fall. That without a question.
I see. So there's this widely shared perception that the United States has lost Afghanistan and Biden bears the responsibility. So what's your take on this perception? Is this a defeat?
It is not a loss, because in order to lose, you have to be able to win. And the United States could not win in Afghanistan. There was no winning. And if we define it that way, we're actually losing sight of strategically why Afghanistan mattered for the United States, for NATO, for its allies, for the world. When we think of Afghanistan, we should think of it of what the original mission was, not what it became, and not what we're living through now, which is a tragedy. But the president, I think, had an impossible situation. He was trapped in terms of what to do next. Any American president would have suffered essentially, or would have had to live through the same consequences we're seeing now when the decision was made to withdraw. That was not going to change. So it's not really a loss, because there was never going to be a win.
Interesting. So you think leaving Afghanistan was a mistake? Or let me ask this way, what did the US invade Afghanistan in the first place? And why did it pull back now after 20 years?
So we have to think of Afghanistan in really two phases. The initial phase was the response to 9/11, going in 2001 through roughly 2003 to eliminate Al-Qaeda and the Al-Qaeda network. That was a strategic victory for the United States. But it was not against the Taliban or in terms of building a new nation. That was not the purpose. The purpose was to remove Al-Qaeda and eliminate that clandestine terrorist organization from being able to hit the United States or its allies. That happened in the first few years. After that, there were a series of missteps, including no one asking, well, do we really need to stay here? Why would we stay here? Is there will over the long term to stay in Afghanistan? Those are questions that were not adequately asked by policymakers. And they're the ones who ultimately make these decisions, right? It's not the military commanders. There is fault there. And we have to look at this through two lenses: the strategic, why things happened, and the operational, how things happened. There are question marks on both ends, right? And throughout the 20 years, there are question marks related to the military's performance, what it was trying to achieve, what it was trying to do at the operational level. In other words, building Afghan forces, building police forces, helping, quote unquote, stand up a state, a nation state, because that's exactly what the United States was doing and its allies. But that's a separate consideration from should the United States and its allies attempt to do that. Is it possible? Is Afghanistan, after the removal of Al-Qaeda, what remained was a strategic problem for the United States? Many would argue, including myself, that it wasn't and it's not today. A lot of the concern today is Afghanistan going to become a haven for terrorists? Well, we have to really define what terrorist means. Terrorists like Al-Qaeda, how many organizations are there globally that were secret, clandestine organizations? Not many. if any, really, that have global reach. Al-Qaeda had about 300 to 400 individuals. Those individuals, those networks were taken out in the first few years after 2001, after 9/11 specifically, obviously, the first 2 years after that. So the threat has changed. Also, the international security environment has changed. Not only our countries, but international organizations, the United States specifically, its law enforcement and its intelligence arms, are cognizant of how terrorists move, how they finance, how they build support. So it's a fundamentally different environment for anyone who wants to be an international terrorist today than pre-9/11.
I see. I will come to that also, that concept of war on terror in general. But let's go a little bit, further and in more details. We are talking about 20 years, Mr. Herman. Hundreds of lives have been lost and billions of dollars have been spent. Some really wonders why. For what exactly? You also served in Afghanistan as a soldier. So what did you really do there? Or what didn't you do so that we have this outcome today?
Okay, so let's take the first step, or the first question in terms of after 20 years, what was achieved? Again, very little was achieved because there was no strategic aim beyond, quote unquote, staying in place. So a lot of the arguments that you're seeing on television today, pundits are saying the United States should have stayed here with 5,000 more troops. But to achieve what? The United States, the speed at which the Afghan regime fell, right? No Afghan military, no police forces. The speed shows us how hollow the entire project was. That there was actually nothing there. In a recent piece I wrote, I called it a mirage. It was a mirage. 20 years, really. Let's take back from 20 years, 17 years roughly, right? Because there was an aim and a goal the first 3 years. There was a reason for the United States to go there and to apply maximum pressure on the regime at the time, remove it if necessary, and it was necessary in order to target Al-Qaeda. So that was all necessary. What happened afterwards is the problem. The problem is that lives were wasted, not just American lives. I have friends who died there, and I carry, all of us who served there carry those memories with us at all times. But Afghan lives, of course, the cost on the Afghan people, and what will come now, we have to, be mindful of that and not forget that. At the same time, what was the alternative? There was no alternative. To argue that the United States should stay another 30 years, 40 years, 10 years, that's not really a viable alternative in terms of U.S. domestic will or will anywhere else in the world. It's easy to say, well, we should stay there, but again, for what purpose? What strategic purpose in terms of U.S. national security interests?
I think
there's not,
about,
again,
Yeah. Please go ahead.
No, I was going to say that the problems in terms of the failure of institutions inside Afghanistan is only an operational problem. It's not a strategic problem in terms of that doesn't answer why Afghanistan failed. The reason Afghanistan failed is because there really is no sense of a nation state, even pre-Taliban, compared, again, I'm comparing it to what the Taliban offer. For the United States and Western analysts, and I think the public, we see the Taliban as this kind of alien other, right? It's like, who are these guys who are, the commentary. But in reality, they are not another. They are just as much a part of an Afghan nation as anyone else. That they have abhorrent, very, uncivilized way of thinking about governance, about life, about the rights of women, about the rights of the individual. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that they're an alien force invading Afghanistan. And that's something we never realized. That we thought that American forces could replace what the fact that there was no, or take the place of local national forces that really had no will. And that will never really built up over time. We also have to remember something in the last few years, and there's some good analysts that have tracked this, that the Afghan forces suffered a high number of losses in the last few years. especially in the last 4 years, both their elite units as well as the regular army. That has built up over time. So in other words, the Taliban walking into Kabul and walking into all these provincial capitals in the last week didn't just happen overnight. It's the result of years of losses that the Afghan army as an institution suffered.
So yeah, there are so many lessons driven from the case of Afghanistan, and you touched upon on many of them. How would you sum up the lessons driven from the case of Afghanistan, Mr. Harman, I wonder? Because as far as we understood now, nation building or state remodeling, let's say, is not something that a foreign force can come and achieve within 20 years, even 50 years or more. So what are the other lessons driven from this case?
There are both strategic and operational lessons. At the strategic level, for the United States, again, from the U.S. perspective, we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing X, Y, and Z? Just because the United States can stay in a place for 20 years, right? There's a few other countries that could do what the United States could do at the operational level. Doesn't mean it should. It doesn't mean it's a good idea. So I'll give you a practical example. There's a lot of argument being made now that the United States leaving Afghanistan is going to open the door for Iran, for Russia, for China to influence Afghanistan. My honest answer to that is, why is that America's problem? The reason is that a destabilized Afghanistan is actually a bigger problem for the Iranians, for the Russians, and for the Chinese than for the United States. So in public, you're going to hear a lot of PR, right? Propaganda from the Chinese, others, on the images that we're seeing on TV. But privately, they probably would have preferred that the United States stays bogged down in Afghanistan for the next 20 years, and that the United States does the hard work of, quote unquote, sustaining or maintaining a presence there while they can be provocative. And this applies to the Iranians, the Russians, or the Chinese. So the biggest lesson is, why, to ask strategically, why are we doing this, or why shouldn't we do this? The operational lessons in terms of trying to build out institutions in place that has no sense of a state, or whether a state doesn't exist, is maybe a better way to put it, leads to the results we're seeing today. So there's nothing really the United States military on its own could have done in the last 17 years to change the result today. Final lesson in terms of lessons. It's not the military fault here. They have responsibility for certain things, but it's really the policymakers in the United States, the decision makers, who didn't ask the right questions, or if they didn't like the answer, and then moved forward in a certain fashion. But it's really an issue beyond just military, tactical, or operational issues, or how many on the ground, or how big the Afghan army was. Now, I imagine there are, and don't be surprised if there are eventually assessments that come out in public that the American intelligence community assessed that the speed of this thing was gonna happen as it happened, right? The problem is that for any American policymaker to come out and say, well, listen, we think this is going to collapse in 15 days instead of saying 6 months, going to make the collapse faster, because the confidence level is going to disappear even faster. So it's a very tricky situation for policymakers and for obviously military leaders to come out publicly and say, we think this may or may not happen. Again, because we're talking about likelihoods, right? There's no certainty here. We're always talking about likelihood. How certain is it, or how likely is it that X, Y, and Z happen? So that's how I frame the issue in terms of U.S. lessons learned and some things to look out for.
Roger that. So, Mr. Harman, are American national security interests strategically threatened by instability in Afghanistan or by a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan?
I would argue no. The reality is that even if there is a terrorist group that, for example, is given space to operate by the Taliban, or in places that the Taliban does not control, right, in Afghanistan, what we call ungoverned spaces. That's one of the key kind of concern from a national security perspective, looking for ungoverned spaces that no one or a terrorist organization could take root, right? What kind of a threat is that really to the United States and to the West? One, I think, lessons of what has happened after 9/11 is that these groups, while operationally a threat, in other words, they could target individuals, they could target facilities. They could target civilian targets. They're not actually strategic or existential threats to the United States and the West. What is a strategic or existential threat to the West is our reaction to it, right? It's invading a country when we didn't, and trying to reshape an entire region when that's not really the threat. So that's where we have to think about, not that a terrorist group could, detonate a bomb. That is a threat. Look, we should never minimize the potential loss of American life or any life anywhere in the world. But that's a different evaluation or value system that we use in terms of thinking about how the United States uses national power and its allies, right? The British, even, for example, Turkey, how we use national power to, again, I had a friend years ago who worked in the Department of Defense who said to me, we spent billions of dollars and trillions of dollars going after about 400 guys, because that's what Al-Qaeda was. And so when we think about that just a pause, we need to pause. And in terms of what's going to happen, again, the United States, this is not a dire situation strategically. This is arguably not a strategic loss. It's probably more strategically concerning for Russia, who doesn't want instability in the stands in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, et cetera. The Iranians, the Taliban are not, we're talking about Sunni versus Shia. The Iranians don't have friends in Afghanistan, really. So they're concerned. For them, and for the Chinese as well, there's more strategic considerations for them, actually, of concern than the United States.
So I was going to just ask you, you already touched upon, but still we can maybe, you can add some more answer. Okay. So because some argue that the U.S. should stay in Afghanistan to counter terrorism threat, or as well as counter Iran, Russia, and China. So you don't see a major security challenge ahead then, am I right?
No, I don't think that that's a coherent way to think about the strategic priorities of the United States. Why? Because it doesn't take into account what are the concerns of the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians. The idea that Iran is going to be more influential in Afghanistan or can exert a tremendous amount of influence in Afghanistan is really the wrong way to approach and to think about how influential Iran can be. Iran, for example, and I'll just take a quick survey of these countries. Iran is actually surrounded by enemies, and it has a lot of organic, in terms of historic enemies. So it's in a tricky situation. It's deeply, involved in Syria and has continued to be. So it's not like this is good for Iran. This is actually potentially destabilizing for Iran. For the Russians, there's a couple of areas of concerns for the Russians. The destabilization of what's called its near abroad, right? So there we're talking about the former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan that have, and obviously Russia's own Muslim population. So it's got its own concerns, which drive its priorities. Again, Russia does not have any desire to go into and stabilize or intervene in Afghanistan. What it wants is stability. The United States really provided that stability. China, similar thing. China has they have the capacity, but arguably they don't have the desire to go in and replicate what the United States just did. No country wants to do that. So again, what are the real threats then strategically? I'm not, it's a separate issue to talk about what we're seeing on the ground today or the last, over the weekend. Though that's a tragedy that's going to carry over. But I want to frame it also in a different way or an additional way. In terms of how we think the long-term impacts for the United States are what could be. A lot of imagery there's been a lot of images shown comparing this to Saigon in 1975 and the quote-unquote loss in Vietnam. What people then conveniently forget is that there was no real strategic impact for the United States after Vietnam. And so this idea that what we're seeing today is going to diminish the United States. Arguably, what has diminished the United States, it's its unwillingness to course correct after making strategic mistakes for 17 years in Afghanistan. The invasion of Iraq, for example, another mistake that it took a long time for the United States to course correct. I want to make one other important point here about Afghanistan, both about the U.S. experience and any country that wants to intervene there, is the role of Pakistan. Pakistan is a country that has a tremendous influence, not only over Afghanistan, but over specific elements like the Taliban. Elements within Pakistani intelligence, within Pakistani elites, not all of them, but there are, key supporters there. Without, the Taliban were never going to go away as long as that existed. So this idea that there was a military solution or a kind of military police solution to stabilizing Afghanistan was also not taking that into account enough. The reality that the Taliban exist not just in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan and are supported by elements there and have always been, despite American attempts to kind of, hopefully to change that dynamic. It never worked.
I see. So, Mr. Herman, this whole notion or concept of war on terror should be revised or updated, you think, as the 20th anniversary of 9/11 approaches? What do you think?
It should be retired. We need to retire that, because the reality is the threat on 9/11 and the years afterwards, and arguably today, is from networks or specific groups. Now, there is no real, I would argue, comparable group to what existed before 9/11 in terms of Al-Qaeda. The world, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa or even places in the Middle East where there's a lot of confusion between insurgency and terrorism. Terrorism, we have to think about it as kind of a group that is strategically weak and even operationally weak turns to terrorism because they're not strong enough to become insurgents who want to eventually take over a country. And so what we find is that countries since 9/11 and this kind of global war on terror frame, which should be retired, this idea of terrorism everywhere. The reality is we have insurgency in a lot of different places. We have local grievances, local issues driving instability, driving fragility in different countries. But there is not a threat like there was pre-9/11. Now, not just because of the kind of framing that I'm giving it right now, but also because the security services across the world in different countries have evolved, right? They have evolved and they have taken steps to protect their populations, their infrastructure, the way we travel, the way finance, right? The idea of how illicit finance occurs today is much different, and how it is tracked and monitored, money laundering, those types of things, than it was pre-9/11. So there's a host of systems in place that are continually evolving and being reshaped to take on any potential terrorist threat. But again, we have to ask by whom. ISIS, for all its success, was really, and it has always been, an insurgency, not an organization like Al-Qaeda. It gets confused a lot, right? You hear Al-Qaeda, you hear ISIS, but they're not really the same thing. ISIS is an insurgency rooted in the Levant, in Iraq, and obviously in Syria, that wanted to build a new nation state, forge a new nation state. That's fundamentally different than an international organization that really doesn't have roots anywhere, that acts in secret, that is not strong enough to act on the ground in a specific place. So the threat environment has changed dramatically in the last 20 years for a variety of reasons. And so that's what we have to think about this differently. We have to retire this idea of counterterrorism driving action. What we're really looking at, and we have to look at it through a local lens more than anything else. Look, this is a very complicated problem, because there's countries who, wanting more assistance, right, have called their own insurgencies terrorists and potentially international terrorists, so that drives and creates a tension. So we've got to find a way to rebalance the approach. Again, I'm talking from the U.S. perspective, how to rebalance that approach to work with countries and say, look, actually, what we need to do is address local issues. What are the real drivers for radicalization, for insurrection? Once you address those drivers, and again, it's different, it's different depending on where you're looking at, then you can better tackle the challenges in this century. Thinking about it through a lens of terrorism, it actually is not going to do that. And we have tried that. The United States primarily talks about terrorism and counterterrorism all over the world. And we don't have more stability. We have actually less stability. So that should tell us that we've got to rethink some of these approaches.
Well, hopefully this will be a start of a new era, let's say.
It will, well, look, this is incredibly difficult to watch, obviously. There are mistakes that have been made in the last few weeks. Again, operationally, not the decision to leave. There was really no other option. But there are admittedly mistakes being made in terms of how security was set up at the airport, the assessments that drove what was going to be required, right, in the final days of the American presence in Afghanistan. Those are legitimate questions to ask to find out why those decisions or certain wrong decisions were made. But I do think ultimately what we have to think about here in the long span of history is, did President Biden and this administration do the right thing for the United States and its allies over time, obviously. And I think that ultimately, I think the history will favor this decision in spite of the obviously very difficult images that we're seeing at Kabul airport, et cetera. But there was really no other option. And sometimes you have to, in order to break out of kind of a strategic trap that the United States was now found, it found itself here in Afghanistan, you have to make some very tough decisions. President Biden did that, and that doesn't mean that there's no responsibility or that we don't have to understand. We have to unpack, really, the questions you have asked me today are part of that process to understand why everything went wrong and obviously how it went wrong.
Yeah. Roger that. Well, time is up. Thank you so much, Mr. Herman, for participating and for answering our questions. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Feyza.
Evet, böylelikle saat farkını bu haftada noktalamış olduk. ABD'den emekli asker Afganistan'da görev yapmış, aynı zamanda analist Herman de la Roche bizlerleydi. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konukla tekrar görüşmek üzere. Hoşçakalın.